Hey everybody, it's Pastor Jared with this week's Teaching Tuesday. We're going to talk about Holy Communion today, a subject that I realized recently I have not shared enough with you in particular, who are part of our Ridge friends and family. Each week during the lunch hour on Tuesdays, I share these short 10 to 15 minute videos that will hopefully give you something to chew on or think about, maybe even something you will learn about the Christian faith. And I hope that today's lesson might be not just informative, but also might challenge you a little bit, especially as we look to gather again in person for worship and online in the weeks to come. You'll be getting an email sent out and another post will be shared here this afternoon as we look to worship outdoors for Easter, and then starting Sunday, April 11th, allowing for in-person worship in the sanctuary. You'll get more information about that, but in particular on Easter Sunday, we will be celebrating Holy Communion together. Now, one of the questions that people have been asking me more and more is, Pastor Jared, why are we fasting from communion while we are not worshiping together in person? I wanted to speak to that a little bit more in detail because I haven't done so enough during the past year. Let me start by sharing with you a way of categorizing or thinking about our beliefs that I've shared before, but I want to circle back to again. There are three different categories we might think about as we think about our own beliefs, convictions, and otherwise. We could write some of those in pencil, pen, and blood. Now, the beliefs or the convictions we write in pencil, we could categorize those as our opinions, that which can easily be erased, crossed out, and changed to something else. Some days I have a certain opinion about which Mexican restaurant I like the most in town. But depending on the week, that can ebb and flow. And it's different maybe than yours, and that's okay. Especially as we think about like pizza restaurants. We have a million restaurants that make pizza within a square mile of where I'm standing right now. And each of us has our own preferred restaurant and style of pizza. We could consider those to be issues that we write in pencil or opinion. Pen are those beliefs, those convictions that we might call, in respect to church belief, our doctrines. Now, those we hold with a little more conviction. We write with ink. It's a little more difficult to erase those or to white them out and to replace them with something else. When we have an opinion that we write in pen, it matters a little more. We have a little more skin in the game. As it pertains to Christian circles, we can think about some of the distinctions that exist between different denominations. We are United Methodist. We have a profound and deep belief in the grace of God and God's grace that invites us and calls us and equips us to respond to that grace and be participants in God's work of salvation. One of the ways that might distinguish our beliefs from other denominations, though, is with respect to baptism. Some denominations have a greater emphasis on making sure that a person is of a certain age or is immersed underwater. We as United Methodists believe that believe in infant baptism, that it's God's grace that goes before us and woos us and works in us so that we can respond one day. The emphasis that we place on baptism is more on God's part and less so on ours. That's a difference in opinion or in doctrine, in pen. The things that we write in blood, however, that's like our dogma. Those are things that we put our own blood into the game. Like we're all in invested. And for me and for Christians around the world, it's that Jesus is the Savior of the world, that Jesus is the Son of God. That's a dogma that Christians around the world and throughout time share with one another. And for me, like I've put my whole life on that, and that belief. Everything I have in my whole life, I'm leveraging in the belief that Jesus is Lord. Now, these categories can be helpful as we think about Holy Communion, or another word for it, the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper. Different names for it. I'm choosing Holy Communion for a specific reason as we move ahead to other categories. As it pertains to having communion either virtually, so like if I were to break the bread on my phone or camera, and then you on your end were to have your cracker or your bread and your juice at home and doing it together on Sunday mornings, this is more of a matter that might fall in pencil or pen. Bishop Trimble, the bishop of our Indiana conference, has given permission for local pastors to decide how their congregation would be practicing this sacrament of the church. We only have two, baptism and Holy Communion, two sacraments, and gave permission for local pastors, the theologian in residence, to make the decision on what their congregation would do. I have chosen for us to fast from this meal and not to do virtual communion. Let me talk about this before I give my reasons for why I'm making that choice. First of all, I don't think that this is a matter of blood. I think this is closer to doctrine and opinion. I'm not down on my brothers and sisters who have decided and elected pastorally to allow their congregations to serve communion. In fact, there's a little bit of precedence that I believe applies to this conversation that occurred around the 4th, 5th centuries. There was an argument within the church about the efficacy of Holy Communion. How was, or on whom was it contingent to work in conveying and transmitting the grace of God? There was a group of people who said that if the priest who's presiding and the recipient aren't pure in their partaking of the elements, then communion was null and void. They were inevitably chosen to be out of bounds or going in the wrong direction by the wider Christian community who affirmed a doctrine of ex opere operato. Out of the work, it works. The reason being that the efficacy of communion is not contingent upon your holiness or mine. The work of God transmitting God's grace and God's own self into our souls and bodies is God's work, contingent upon God's holiness, contingent upon God's grace, and not on yours and mine. So if you know other Christians or even other Methodists who are partaking of communion at home because that's what their pastor and church have decided to do, wonderful. I believe that out of the work it works, that it's not contingent upon whether or not they're in person or separate, but it's a contingent upon God's grace and sustaining and filling them. And I understand deeply and pastorally how important it is and how difficult it is to fast from this sacred meal with one another. If it was up to me, and maybe it kind of is, I would choose to have it every single week. I miss the nourishment of communion with God and with you. But I have chosen for us to carry the burden of fasting in this meal until we are together again. And let me try to land it home with some of the reasons as to why this is more than an opinion for me. It's like a really, really dark pencil or maybe in pen. See, one of the beauties of communion is that it is God coming to us. This sacred meal is one that Jesus himself instituted. It's one that when he was sitting around a table with his friends and he passed the bread after having broken it and giving thanks. And it's the cup that he passed around after having given thanks. And he said, "Take and eat, take and drink, for this is my body and blood broken and shed for you." There is something deeply personal and beautiful and profound and transforming about the God who comes to us in Jesus. This is what we stake our faith in. This is the whole dogma, blood belief, that, man, we put everything in this particular God who does not sit apart and away, but rather is the God who enters into our lives and into our mess. Communion remembers that, celebrates us, and nourishes our soul with God's own grace and presence. It not only brings God to us, but in so many deep and profound ways, it recenters us and focuses us on God. And man, when we talk about Holy Communion, That's what we're talking about. The communion that God shares within God's own self, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, this eternal, ever ongoing communion of God that we are invited into. Which is why we are refraining from partaking of Holy Communion within the secrecy and intimacy and isolation of our own homes until such time when we're together again. Because communion is not just about God and me. It's not just about me and Jesus. Communion, as instituted by Christ and as embodied and modeled for us by Jesus himself, is always, always, always about God and me and others. There is always the dynamic of the cross that connects us to God, God to us, and us to one another. That's Jesus' embodiment on the cross. Us to God, God to us, and us to one another. The whole word of communion is a word of togetherness, of one bread that's broken for all of us to partake of. The one body of Jesus that is picked and placed in each of our hands for us to partake in non-COVID times. This is why I've chosen for us to refrain from it, because it's not just a Jesus and me in faith. It's an us. It's a we us faith. There's a line in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in which Paul is instructing some of these early Christians to wait on one another, to not have some people partake or not others have feasts and leave people out, but wait until such time when all can be together at the table. Friends, we are in community with God and each other. And until such time when we can actually be together again, we're going to continue to fast from this meal. Now, I will tell you, on Easter, we take it together. There's going to be extra communion elements that have been blessed. And I would love it if you were to personally take an extra cup and cracker and take it to someone's home. Because we are embodied persons, not meant to only have an isolated, individualized faith. That's a heresy. The whole life of Jesus is one that yokes us and brings us together, that widens the table so that more people can be welcomed to the family of God and have their seat that's already reserved for them at the table of Jesus. We have taken on the discipline of fasting from this meal, praying for one another, longing and working toward the day when we can gather together again. But until such time, we fasted until we can all wait and gather at the table. That's that 1 Corinthians 11, I think it's verse 33. It's important, I believe, and I'm deeply convicted, for us to wait until we can do this meal together. Holy communion with one another. So I hope to see you, especially if you're in the area, on Sunday, April 4th, Easter Sunday at 10 a.m. We're going to be having a 90-minute outdoor service that we are so looking forward to and are planning and working hard so that everyone can be welcomed and celebrate the joy of resurrection, the hope of Jesus Christ. Thereafter, we'll be reintroducing in-person worship, so be on the lookout for that. I hope this makes sense. I have more I could probably say and want to say, but I have to keep this to 10 to 15 minutes, so maybe I'll follow up next week. Let me know if you have any questions. It's okay if we're of different opinions on this, and it's okay if you're frustrated or annoyed with me that we're not doing this together. I get it. But I thank you for taking on this fast as we continue to pray and long and work for the day when we can do it together. It's important that it's not just a Jesus and me, but it's an us relationship. It's the relationship, or it's the model of the cross. All right, until next week, have a great day. God bless you, God keep you, and may you continue to widen the tables to the neighbors that you have, to the family members who are estranged, to the friendships that have been distanced in this past year. May you be a person who widens the table of God's grace. Take care.